Chip said, I am the research director at ZETA, or the Zero Emission Transportation Association. And just like any trade association, you might be asking, who are ZETA's members? Who pays my salary? And also are members of the overall kind of EV supply chain here in North America. We represent a couple dozen companies, including some of those right at the key of the US EV transition, like Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid, as well as battery manufacturers like Panasonic, LG, Samsung, and SK. Even companies on the mobility side like Uber and Waymo that you may have heard of. The way I like to think about Zeta's presence in all this is really from upstream all the way downstream of the EV supply chain. So we cover issues of mining and refining, the actual grabbing of those critical minerals for use in electric vehicle batteries, battery manufacturing, the many major facilities that have been uh, produced here in the US under the Inflation Reduction Act and continue even in this more, I'd say, challenging environment. EV manufacturing by the likes of Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid. To be a Zeta member, you have to really be committed to a fully electric transition. So the kind of legacy automakers are not a part of the association, although for those who are, swimming in the same direction or rowing in the same direction, we do a lot of work with the legacy OEMs as well. Can't have EVs without EV charging. And so charging policy and the kind of growth of the charging network has been really interesting to see over the past couple of years. And then finally, this has played less of a part in our kind of EV conversation to date. But over time, things like EV battery recycling, creating a kind of sustainable supply chain, and then grid management. So whether you're talking about cybersecurity, vehicle to grid, or just how are all these EVs going to charge on an 80-degree day here in New York? We have a bunch of companies who work at the kind of grid nexus as well. So as Chip kind of alluded to, the current market moment is pretty complex and contradictory. You might read a headline that makes you feel quite good about where this EV adoption is going, or quite negative, depending on what day. In this, 2025, 2026 period, we've seen used electric vehicles growing as a share of the overall used market. Used EV sales last quarter were up about 20%, while the new sales market shrunk. You're seeing the EV charging network here in the US develop into one that was frankly not up to task a couple of years ago to one that now is very accessible and where road trips are much easier for many Americans than they were before. You see new models coming onto the US market, like the Rivian R2 that's slated to launch in just a couple of months. And so, despite all the pessimism, vehicles like the R2, the Kia EV3, and the BMW iX3 are all slated to come online this year. So, even with the kind of negative policy pullback, there's a lot on the technology side to look forward to. That being said, it isn't all good news, right? Car makers took a $50 billion loss on EVs. And what this math means is essentially the legacy automakers have shifted their priorities since the beginning of the Trump administration towards either internal combustion engine vehicles or hybrids. Many are still keeping their EV portfolio up and running, like GM, like Hyundai, like Kia, but all of them have made an adjustment as a result of not seeing the US market come along as far as they had anticipated. And then finally, I pointed before around the kind of end of the supply chain for Zeta. But this idea that what EVs are going to look like in the future is a lot different than our present experience. You'll see these retired EV batteries having a second life. And we're already seeing that in Texas, where they're being used as stationary storage. So while electric vehicles are very nascent, there's even these sub-industries like recycling and second life that are even newer to the kind of global landscape. So that's kind of how I'd say complex this moment is. I, as a research director, always like to look at data and tell stories through data. So I'm going to show you guys a bunch of slides. If you have questions, I think it works really well at the end to jump into whatever you'd like to talk about, but feel free to throw them into the chat. Chip mentioned that I went to YSE between 2017 and 2019, and I always like to use those years as kind of landmarks because 2017 was the first time globally that passenger electric car sales hit 1 million units. And when I talk about electric vehicles today, I'm talking about both battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. By the time I graduated, the global marketplace had doubled, so 2 million sales annually. And over the next 6 year period, growth was about 10 times. So going from about 2 million annual sales globally all the way to over 20 million sales in 2025. And you'll see an estimate there just because IEA's report, of which this chart is pulled from, typically comes out in May. So the final data takes a little bit longer to get. Not only have electric vehicle sales been up, but really this kind of critical metric of EV share of sale. So it's one thing for growth, but it's another to be eating away at internal combustion engine or hybrids. So EV share of sales globally has gone from about 5% back in 2020 to nearly 25% last year. So you might not see it given where the US is at, around more 10% market share at its kind of recent high. But globally, everyone has shifted towards electric vehicles, really pushed by the Chinese market, which has seen EV share of sale around 50% in recent years, and Europeans, which has been more in that kind of 30% range. Now, the US also accelerated after 2020. Um, you saw the Tesla Model Y come out in kind of the, I'd say, highest use segment of crossover SUVs, going from around 300,000 annual sales in 2020 to about 1.5 million in 2024. And the final 2025 data shows around the same, so about 1.5 million sales. But other countries have outpaced the US. And so you'll hear a lot during today's presentation that things globally are going well, but the US lags behind. Or if you're looking at a glass full, half full type of dimension, the US has made some progress and is better than many markets. But when you look at the growth of China and the EU in particular, the US seems as if it's a laggard, despite being a pretty major auto market. That being said, the US is made of many different states, and those states all tell different stories. What you'll see from this chart in particular is that EV share of sales spiked back in the third quarter of 2025. Not surprising, that's when the federal EV tax credit, the $7,500 that you've heard a lot about, expired. After which you saw an intense pullback in places like Colorado and California. This is expected when you've seen subsidies ended in other countries. You've seen people rush to buy EVs before the expiration of that credit. And what you're going to see over the next couple quarters is a stabilization. Probably not immediately back at this 30% or even in the mid 20s, but where they were maybe about a year ago, right? Beginning of 2025. That's the kind of number I want to see before we talk about growth again. Why did this happen? Not only because of the pullback on the $7,500 credit, but fuel economy standard rollback by the Trump administration, whether you're talking about California waiver and regulations out of California or CO2 emissions programs out of the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, why are we optimistic about EVs and why is the US auto market changed forever? These slides I'm about to show you are going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of the US auto market. First off, sales have hovered around 16 million units for the last 2 decades. So the pie itself is not really growing. It's really the drivetrains that make up the pieces of the pie that are likely to change. And this chart comes from Edmunds. It was before the recent events in the Middle East. And so you would actually maybe expect to see sales this year come in less than what Edmunds thought at the beginning of the year, around 16 million units. Still, the low points are really even post COVID was not particularly low as the 2009 crash where you saw sales about 10 million units. The used market is about double this. So every year you see about 15 million, 16 million new car sales in the US and around 32 to 35 million used vehicle sales. Now, the good news for people who care about climate change or care about new technology is that the US car market is unmistakably changing. So this is also data from Edmunds looking at compound annual growth rate. BEVs and PHEVs have both grown by about 36% and 35% compound annual growth rate. Hybrids, pretty impressive too at 19%. Hybrids were coming from a higher base and now make up, the largest alternative drivetrain last year. No matter how you slice it, you're seeing real emissions reduction by switching to more fuel efficient cars. That being said, the one thing that hybrids and plug-in hybrids can't do is fully eliminate your carbon emissions. So you really do need either battery electric vehicles or what are called range extended EVs or EREVs that drive the vast majority of their time on electric to actually make the dent in climate that many want to see. That being said, it's a long kind of transition, and this is where all the growth in the US market is. So, despite what you might hear on the news, what automakers across the board know is that they have to figure out a solution for BEVs and they have to figure out a solution for hybrids. PHEVs or their kind of next generation iteration might play in the pickup truck space, but you're not going back to your peak ICE vehicles, which was back around 2017, 2018.
Could you say what
Yeah.
PHEVs are? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, of course. PHEVs are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles.
Thank you.
In today's market, PHEVs will typically go about 20 to 35 miles of all electric range. When I'm talking about EREVs or extended range EVs, those are plug-in hybrids that are set up in a different structure of a parallel engine, excuse me, series engine, not parallel, where the basically the backup gas generator is actually recharging the battery. The Chevy Volt actually worked in that way, but you're seeing many Chinese EREVs where they can go 80, 90 miles on all electric range. So more than double the kind of PHEV all electric range.
Hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Why is this all important, or why does this kind of tie into the overall story of the US automobile industry? Well, it centers around this question of affordability. Point blank, all new cars are more expensive. They're approaching around $50,000 in new average transaction price, more than 46% since 2015. And you really haven't seen BEVs and PHEVs come down in price enough here. Now, this is excluding Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid prices, but it really highlights how legacy OEMs have been unable to, on average, offer electric vehicles towards that kind of affordable consumer base. Now, vehicles like the Chevy Bolt and Nissan Leaf are important, or the Kia EV3 that kind of meet that $30,000 to $40,000 price range, but those aren't being sold at high volumes yet. And so what that means is most of the cars that are being sold by automakers are still between $50,000 and $60,000. In addition, the rise of SUVs have helped move average prices in the new car market higher. So you can see in this chart the kind of blue bar, which is your sedan vehicles, and the orange bar, which is SUVs. Since 2009, they've almost inversely switched places. Cars made up over 50% of all new sales in the auto market in the US in 2009. Now they're down to about 17% last year. SUVs used to be around 25% or so of all sales in 2009. And then last year, they were nearly 60%. So when you hear about people saying, oh, these electric vehicles or hybrids are driving costs up, that's not really the case. New technologies do play a role in driving that average vehicle price higher, but things like technology, all the touchscreens and computers in cars, semiconductor chips, and most of all, consumer preferences of size have helped move the overall cost of cars up. And as a result, you've seen the share of new sales of vehicles over $50,000 nearly quadrupling from a decade ago. So those $50,000 plus cars were around 10% of all sales in 2015. And then last year, we're at about 36% of all sales. So when you hear talk of a K-shaped economy, this chart really illustrates it. You're seeing legacy OEMs and dealers really focus on people who have the most money because they're the ones who are able to go back and to afford these new vehicles. What this means for EV makers, both legacy and those represented by ZETA, is there's a real market opportunity for those affordable vehicles. That being said, you only want to sell affordable vehicles in the $30,000 to $40,000 price range if you can make a profit, right? If you're taking on major losses to sell those vehicles, you're less likely to do so. And that's why the kind of falling battery costs that I'll show you in a little bit play such an important role into this EV transition story. One other good piece of news is around the fact that used EVs will be an answer to this affordability challenge. This chart shows how EVs, as a result of a kind of leasing loophole in the federal EV tax credit, increased from about 20% of all EV sales back at the start of 2023 to a peak of nearly 80% at the end of 2024 and hovering between 70 and 80% for the last couple of years. Now, You'll notice that after the EV tax credit expired, that this leasing rate began to fall back. We'll see if that trend continues. But what this means is you're going to see in the next 2 years, and you've already started seeing it, a lot of these EVs returned off lease into the used market. They're coming in with a more comparable value to gas cars and means that people who were priced out of the new car sales market might be able to drive electric for the first time. And that's something at ZETA that we're keeping a close eye on this year. Now, for new potential buyers of EVs, when people come up and say, Corey, why doesn't everyone go electric? These are really the four concerns that come to mind: range anxiety, charging anxiety, price premium, and then the cost to replace a battery. And for this chart here, I really threw on three different countries to give you a sense of how the US differs and is the same as some of these other major markets. So in China, you see a lot more electric vehicles and they're cheap. So you see the cost premium far less of a concern. They have faster charging, so you see the range and time to charge is far less of a concern than in Germany and the US, where we kind of lag the Chinese. In all three markets, there is a kind of anxiety around eventually replacing the battery. But the good news is that overall, these EV batteries have lasted a lot longer than expected. In many cases, you would expect a vehicle to last between 10 to 13 years. And, some studies show that batteries might last 16 to 20 years. We really don't fully know. That being said, there is a battery warranty for electric cars in the US for about 8 years or 100,000 miles. And I think not enough people know that information, which could help assuage some of these concerns. Now, another piece of good news is that electric vehicles in the models in the US have increased dramatically. So you've gone from back in 2018, less than 50 models of variety. And as you've approached this year, you have around 300 models between plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles. This is data from Atlas Public Policy. So this includes a lot of models that, have different trims or have some variants. So I wouldn't say that you necessarily have 300 different options to look at as so much so as different trims and variants of those 300 models. Even still, using their own kind of metrics, you've grown by about 6 times since 2018. And overall, the expectation for the US market, despite some of these challenges, is still pretty optimistic, even with all the policy pullback at the federal level. So I used to work at BNEF, and you can see that there are two BNEF reports here in this chart, which shows EV share of sales outlook from 2025 to 2030. BNEF, my last year there, saw EV share of sale at about 48%. This was prior to Trump being elected, prior to the fuel economy standards being pulled back and the repeal of the credit. BNEF put out another report and they lowered that projection to slightly more than 30%. Similarly, you've seen things like the Repeat Project and JD Power more in that 20 to 30% range. And what I always remind people of is last year, EV share of sale was 10%. So even in our worst case scenario, you're still going to see the market grow by 2 times by 2030. And in an earlier best case scenario, you saw that closer to 5 times. There are going to be elections in between now and 2030. There are state actions in between now and 2030, and I'd say new market entrants. And so these are only a snapshot in time based on the economic models of where you would expect EV sales in the US to go. But it's a reason to not lose hope, even as policies have been completely pulled away from market support. Of course, electric vehicles are not only a US story, but a global story. This has really been driven by the falling price of batteries. So Bloomberg NEF puts out one of my favorite pieces of research every year called the Lithium Ion Battery Price Survey. And this survey put out most recently in December found that battery pack prices fell to about $108 per kilowatt hour last year. North America was a little bit higher, around $123 per kilowatt hour. But nevertheless, you've seen global prices fall by about 90%. And EV batteries make up about 30% to 50% of a vehicle cost. So as these battery pack prices have come down, so too have automakers been able to pass those savings down to consumers and offer more affordable models. I mean, I remember back, let's talk when I graduated WashU, Tesla Model S was going for $80,000 a year. Now you have some EVs in the market today. Chevy Bolt starts at about $29,000. That's dramatic sea change in 13 years. And in addition, what a Chevy Bolt or a Nissan Leaf offer today, value-wise, is as many miles as the Tesla Model S did, 13 years ago. So a lot of improvement in the product and also in the pricing. And as a result of this, we've seen new automakers emerge onto the global scene. So Tesla and BYD being the largest of them, going from making fairly insignificant sales back in 2018 to combined over, nearly 6 million sales. And as I kind of stated at the top, the global pie too doesn't change too much. You're looking at between 80 and 90 million units of sales each year. For Tesla and BYD, if they were at essentially zero a decade ago, you're now pulling out almost 10% from the existing automakers that did not exist previously. Similarly, you've seen China become, a kind of afterthought in the automotive production market to really 40% of global auto production for passenger cars. Meanwhile, the US has gone from about 15% of global production down to just about 2%. So take away EVs. Let's say you don't care about climate change at all. And just from a kind of global competitiveness standpoint, you have China on the rise and you have US falling behind. And so if you care about the kind of national security angle, if you care about jobs here in America, this should be one of the scariest charts out there for you because China is beginning to export and they are beginning to reach markets here in North America, Canada and Mexico being two important ones. And their kind of rise has been the story over the past couple decades, not just the last 5 years. And that production is also translated into sales, right? Because you might just say, okay, they produce a lot of vehicles, so what? But you saw in the last couple years, the Chinese actually surpassed the Japanese automakers, which are the largest in the world, with Toyota being the largest among them. The US sells a good deal, but is also basically stabilized in terms of how much they're selling. Why do so many people, gravitate towards Chinese EV models? Well, you're seeing more affordable price, as you can see on the chart on the left. Whether you're talking the sedans, the SUVs, or pickup trucks. And of course, in the US, the SUV segment is what matters most. Um, Even the Tesla Model Y, right, in China, can go a little bit further, although different kind of, I'd say, mileage expectations, but cost-wise, pretty similar. You're getting beat out by the BYD song and other BYD models. And if the US doesn't act, many of these models could be coming to shore here in the future. Not only does China dominate kind of the auto production side, but what we at Zeta focus on is something called the midstream supply chain. So, in addition to that mining, it's this idea of critical minerals, processing, and battery component production. China continues to dominate this critical mineral refining space, with really only Europe being a small portion of that kind of overall effort. What this means is whether you're thinking about batteries that use nickel, lithium, cobalt, manganese, or graphite, which is pretty much all of them, you need to send those materials to China to have them refined to then be produced into cathode anode material. And should be cathode active material and anode active material to eventually go into a battery. This is a major problem because if have been following the Strait of Hormuz and challenges in foreign policy there, you can imagine that not having a diversity of sources around processing could be a problem, not just for the US, but other countries in the future. Now, a few kind of shorter segments because I realize I rambled on a while, but electrification is spreading onto new segments. So we spend a lot of time looking at Teslas and Rivians and Lucids and fast cars, but electric vehicles go so much further than just passenger cars. You've got vans and trucks. So I'm here in Brooklyn and see a lot of Amazon EDV vans on the road, electric buses. These are transit buses, according to BNEF, which is heavily kind of swayed by China, falling at about 43% of all global sales at the end of 2024 and those electric two and three wheelers. So you don't think about them that much necessarily over here, but they're huge in Southeast Asia. They're huge in Thailand. They're huge in India, and they really make a major impact on overall carbon emissions. And so the good news for climate and the good news for the kind of overall growth of EV adoption is it's not just about the US and it's not just about passenger cars, but really a lot of different solutions for electrification. Now, that being said, medium and heavy duty electric vehicles are beginning to follow the same kind of trajectory of growth as we saw in passenger cars. And similarly, you'll note that essentially nothing in terms of sales up until the start of 2022. And then you begin to see that kind of hockey stick over the past, I'd say, 2 years. We're pretty nascent here on commercial vehicles, and it'll probably take us another 5 years to really hit new heights. But it's another area to keep your eye on because every Class 8 truck that you're getting off of the roads is a huge emissions boon. Every time you're taking a local van to, do last mile delivery, that has an important localized air pollution impact. So don't sleep on commercial vehicles either. Now, on charging infrastructure, I spent a lot of time talking about the vehicles, but this is the other piece of the puzzle. The US public charging network has doubled since 2020. So this is maybe stat number two that most people don't realize. You've gone from about 100,000 public charging connectors in 2020 to almost 200,000 public charging connectors in 2024. And I'm doing a webinar on this next week, but if you probably look at this data again, you'd see it now in 2020, six at the beginning of the year at nearly 250,000 public charging connectors. So the US has made a lot of progress, and this has really been private sector led because if you follow the public charging infrastructure kind of debate, you may know that the National EV Infrastructure Program, or NEVI, has been frozen and stalled by the Trump administration. And so public companies like Ayana, Tesla, EVgo have really stepped in and done the bulk of this work. And here again is the same kind of chart with a little bit more data going to the beginning of this year. You can see it approaching that 250,000. A lot more of those kind of level two chargers that you plug in for maybe 4 to 10 hours to fully charge up. But even the EV fast charging network is approaching around 70,000 public charging connector ports. So it means whether you're leaving your EV alone for a while or fast charging it, there are a lot more needs being met. Where do we expect that to go by 2030? Well, according to IEA, you would expect to see almost 550,000 public charging connectors. Again, IEA's reports change every year. They should have their new outlook out in May. But it highlights that there's a lot more chargers to come. And that's why you see a lot of business moving into this space. Because whether a used EV customer or a new EV customer, same chargers, same electrons. So I expect that we will continue to see growth in that this year. Now, why is charger build out so important? Well, this is a survey from Pew Research Center from a couple years ago, but I love the findings because it really illustrates how consumer behavior changes depending on where their charging station is. If you live, less than a mile away from a charging station, you're usually pretty supportive of electric vehicles. You're pretty likely to consider or seriously consider an EV for your next purchase. But if you're like most people and you're 2 miles away or more, you're going to be in that kind of EV skeptic framing. So the more chargers we can build out, the more we can kind of physically come into contact with consumers, the better. Even though we know that 80 to 85% of people charge at home currently, it's not about the current EV owners, but really about reaching out to those kind of mass market consumers who are not yet ready to go electric and convince them that, the infrastructure is there to meet their needs. Okay, wrapping up on two more sections here. First on US EV investments and policy. Since 2020, we've seen about $262 billion in investment announcements in clean energy. So that's battery, critical minerals, solar, wind, transmission, and hydrogen. Of that, 85% of that was in electric vehicles and batteries. So to highlight how important the battery industry is for Americans, kind of not only electric vehicle adoption, but around the kind of grid and the kind of deployment of solar and wind, you can see it pretty plainly in this chart. And this is including some of those clawbacks and some of those changes in recent months from legacy OEMs. But of course, as a result of these policies, like the ending of the 30D credit or changes in fuel economy standards in clean energy tax credits, there is a real harm done. There are jobs being lost that would have otherwise been created, or loans canceled, or projects canceled, or repurposed. So it's, not to say that everything is roses, that all the growth is coming, that, all of our kind of competitiveness will be the same as if the One Big Beautiful Bill Act hadn't passed. But there's so much more positive there than negative to date. Of course, things could get worse, things could change, but we really try and keep an eye on where the investments are flowing. And it's easy to look at the data and the numbers, but what do these kind of investments actually mean to Americans, real people? Well, they mean direct jobs, right? Those EV factories and those battery production factories. They mean indirect jobs. Every EV charger means an electrician is needed or a construction worker to put together these factories. And then these EV and battery facilities induce jobs, right? Places like Savannah, Georgia, which have seen a big influx thanks to the Hyundai and LG facilities, right? That means more local restaurants seeing business, hospitality, and commercial real estate values. So, it often gets thrown into partisan politics around these facilities, but they have a real jobs impact on the ground. And that's why you see a lot less partisanship around electric vehicles and batteries at the state level. And speaking of the states, states are attempting to fill the incentive gap that is left by the repeal of the 30D credit. States do not have as much money to be able to kind of give consumer subsidies, but you can still find a kind of range of everything from $750 in Colorado up to $3,500 in Massachusetts, depending on, the availability of these vouchers. Don't know how long they'll all be able to keep it up as EV share of sale rises in these states. But, you know, states are doing the best they can to kind of keep this going, whether it's focusing on these incentives or building out new charging infrastructure. And in closing, because I went through a lot of slides and I really appreciate you all sitting with me on a beautiful, sunny, hot afternoon, here's a kind of recap of what we talked about. The current market is complex and contradictory. There's a lot of good news out there, but there's also a lot of warning signs and negative signals. EV adoption has come a long way in a short time, reaching about 25% globally last year. And while the US market is unmistakably changing, what that future looks like is really up for grabs. Could we be in a conversation 5 years from now where hybrids are off the charts in terms of the market share, where EVs recover, or we could be in a world where they both grow more slowly? Affordability is a multifaceted question, but I really do believe that EVs are well situated to be an attractive option, whether you're talking those new models or used. The global competition is on, and China has a strong hand. And I think a lot of charts here show why. The public US charging network is improving, but there's still more work to do. And then federal policy has pulled back on cleaner cars, but states may offer at least a short-term lifeline. In the long term, you'll probably still need at least fuel economy standards to help this transition move forward. That being said, the future trajectory of EVs and hybrid adoption will also be impacted by all those who work in it. So whether people on this call work in the kind of EV industry or clean energy, appreciate everything that you do. And also just remember that these are data and forecasts taken from a particular moment in time. It can be impacted by the work of many people. So to still keep optimistic even during challenging moments. And yeah, I'll just end on here's my contact information. Chip, we can go through questions and
Yeah,
whatever you want. Do you want to read them out to me, or I can read them over however you prefer?
I think we can read these out. All right. So Bob Schloss put two questions up. He was the well, I'm gonna turn it over to Bob and ask him to ask one of the two so we can spread the wealth, so to speak. And if there's time, we'll go back to his second question or whatever. So Bob, I'll let you go first. Why don't you ask it yourself?
I guess my question is about the potential of the U.S. seizing a new export market for two and three wheelers and very low cost vehicles in Africa and Central and South
Mm.
America and so forth. And given the bipartisan interest in the U.S. doing manufacturing, um, is there a reason why that won't happen? Because we can't make enough batteries or whatever?
Yeah, so I mean to give a kind of succinct answer on two and three wheelers, right? It's even though they're using electric vehicle batteries, the factories have to be set up for those two and three wheelers to export in a certain way. So I don't want to say that we can never do any of that. And I think Africa in particular is one area that there is not nearly enough attention on. And you see in a lot of African countries things like internal combustion engine bans happening. I haven't seen to date, both in terms of South America or Africa, companies specifically focused on those markets, but they probably should. If anything, I'm more wary that the traditional OEMs are letting up too much in Latin America in the passenger car space. And you've seen Chinese companies like BYD move into Latin America.
Barry Kresh, do you want to ask your question? I can read it for you if you want.
I'll be happy to ask it. So, when you were discussing consumer concerns, one thing
Hmm.
that seemed to me conspicuously absent was range anxiety. You had something that was related, which is charge time, but it's not the same thing. So, are you simply hearing less about it, or was that just a shorthand phrase to capture all of the dimensions of taking a road trip?
Yeah, so I will say, I'll share the slide again. They did have driving range as one of the kind of leading indicators. So it could be the chart was not clear. I did not make the or the categorization there. That would be your ranging anxiety. I will say that most of the time when you look at surveys across the board, you do see more of that charging anxiety and cost concerns compared to range because electric vehicles in both the US and Germany have just gotten a lot more efficient. So you're now seeing electric vehicles on average with 270 miles range to 300. More so people will kind of say, I'm worried about charging it and don't know where to charge it, and less kind of issues with the product than there were, maybe about 10 years ago or 15 years ago. When one thing's range anxiety, it's more so the idea that my electric vehicle battery in itself can't go very far, or I don't trust it to go the amount of miles that you expect. And there's a lot more kind of faith in the product than there was previously, even despite the kind of data I showed you on that one chart.
Great, thank you. Barry Abel, do you want to read or ask yours, or I can read it for you? It's in the chat.
Hello? Hello?
Hello, go ahead. Well, I'll read it for Barry. Is any work being done on rentals and car shares for EVs? Reducing car ownership is also important for the environment, plus it increases affordability. But since EVs are currently more expensive, they're riskier to let strangers drive.
There are definitely examples of that. I was at the fourth conference in Michigan this past fall and spoke with someone at Zipcar who was doing like a lot of research on how to kind of increase EV usage for their market. With rental cars in particular, there is a bit of a challenge following a kind of effort by Hertz a couple years ago to really go heavily into electric vehicles. Um, Hertz's bet ended up being kind of mistimed with the residual value of the cars and also had a lack of charging infrastructure to prepare for the purchase of many EVs. So on the rental car company side, you've seen a lot of hesitancy because of how the Hertz effort went. You do see a lot of electric rideshare efforts. So Uber and Lyft are members of ZETA, and both companies have been pretty active in pushing their drivers towards electric driving. So a long way of saying whether you're talking kind of individual rideshare like a Zipcar, there are both pilots in California and also companies trying to do it. I'd say rental car companies, not so much, even though some of them still offer it as an option. And then rideshare, definitely.
Great. Amy Nichols, do you want to ask your question about public transportation?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. I I have a little bit of an EV background myself.
Yeah.
I can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Mhm.
Perfect. I have a little bit of an EV background, but more from the point of working for the Department of Ecology in the state of Washington. And we were really focused on public investments in EVs, whether that was electrifying ferries
Yeah.
or really also like heavy duty commercial vehicles. And I wanted to ask about uh, kind of like the public, uh, you know, whether buses and things like that, what EV adoption has looked like, if you happen to know those trends. And then also, if you have
Sabina?
any question or like any insight about the heavy duty market as well.
Yeah, really good questions. And like honestly, Amy, could be like a whole conversation or smarter than people than me talking at each. To kind of anchor yours for medium and heavy duty, the way I'd say it is vans are electrifying quite quickly in Europe and China, and the potential here in the US is quite high. So that's like your 4D Transit, those Amazon Rivian vans, those kind of stopping a lot, intercity, medium or light commercial vans. Medium and heavy is really at the beginning of the story here. As that chart showed, it's starting to kick off in China. In particular, what the US runs into is an economies of scales problem. The batteries have to be so big on those medium and heavy duty vehicles that you really need to either have policy incentives to drive the upfront cost down, or frankly, OEMs who know what they're doing, who can actually produce a good product. You've seen a lot of companies in the medium and heavy space go bankrupt, frankly, by not being able to. I'll use the Proterra example. Proterra has sold buses, great quality buses. Challenge there is they couldn't build enough quickly because cities were not paying them fast enough. And so, without reforms to how these companies are being paid for their medium and heavy duty vehicles, they're not going to be either be able to build them fast enough. Now, companies like Volvo Trucks, who sell a bunch of ICE vehicles, might be able to subsidize their kind of EV spending, but then you still need policy to encourage them to build it. Um, Fortunately, you see companies like Tesla doing the semi, which could be kind of a market mover, Harbinger Trucks, more companies focusing on that space. On electric school buses, you also see a lot of companies focusing on that. So it's coming, but you still need to get battery costs down and you have to make the procurement process a lot easier, or you might just risk companies overextending themselves. And unlike in China, right, where BYD was selling hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of electric buses, and the government could say, we just got you for it. Here in the US, if you can't really afford to wait, and if you don't get paid and you have to lay everyone off, then you're going to be left with a kind of stranded asset.
Yeah, that is true, but I still have a dream of electric fire trucks.
No, it's like
Responding.
yeah,
So,
I'm not here,
um,
not here to crush dreams. Just saying that
no, no.
the challenges.
Yes, thank you so much for that perspective.
David Bergman, you're up next. You want to ask your question there?
Sure, it's getting a little afield from our specific topic, but I tend to look at a lot of this from an urban point of view,
Yeah,
living in New York City, et cetera. And one issue I think with EVs, and I want to hear your opinion on this, is that they don't really solve the general transportation problem. It's shifting to a somewhat cleaner energy source, depending upon the energy supply. But
yeah.
we're still having people generally in private vehicles, which in cities is not the goal. So does the proliferation of EVs offer people an excuse to stay in cars when we really
Mhm.
want to be getting them out of cars?
Oh my God, David, I feel like there's so many angles I can go on that because
Yeah.
yeah, you could take it on. Number one, Corey's personal opinion doesn't even matter for like what you guys decide to do, but right, you could say EVs for things like wire, robo taxis, right, would be the argument of if people have access to Waymos and driverless vehicles, they may never buy a private car and
Mhm.
just use those. So you still want to make sure you're building up your electrification technology to be used in those or the kind of transit buses that Amy was referring to. You still need to build out that technology and battery expertise no matter what. I live in New York City as well, and mostly use the subway and public transit. And so things in Europe that you've seen is basically congestion taxes there to kind of get at your same
Yeah.
challenge. Um, so I always like to say, not just in this is whenever I'm having a kind of conversation with someone about kind of EVs versus public transit, where it could be a both
Mhm.
argument for like decades to come. And given how high transport emissions are today, and with 290 million vehicles in the private fleet, you have to start replacing those or, convincing people to take more public transit. I think in the meantime, you have a lot of space for both.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Um, John Currington, you want to ask your question there? I don't know if he's still on. I'll ask it for him. Recently, there have been a few new stories about lithium iron phosphate batteries
Hmm.
and how much more stable and less expensive these batteries are than the lithium cobalt nickel batteries. How much of an
Yeah.
effect will these new batteries have?
Yeah, so lithium iron phosphate is a battery chemistry that the US actually invented and then didn't take advantage of, was sold to China and Chinese company, and they basically monetized it. By removing the nickel and cobalt, you're getting that expensive minerals out of the battery. And battery makers like BYD and CATL have been able to not only use LFP, but improve LFP and its kind of energy density so that the kind of premium that NMC batteries had previously effectively almost no longer exists. The interesting thing about LFP that many of you may know is that if you have an EV like myself, you're told to charge it to 85 to 90% because you don't want to degrade the battery. Because of how LFP is produced, you actually charge that to 100%. So even if the LFP battery gets 270 miles and the NMC battery gets 300 miles, right, their effective difference might be the same when you're actually using the vehicle. And so it's cheaper. It's has some benefits on the kind of charging side. The challenge for the US has been it has been made here, right? So they've had to either import it from China. You're seeing LG start making LFP next year, and I think GM as well. So good news is it should have an impact in a positive way, and not only LFP, but lithium manganese rich batteries as well. And I think thinking about these new chemistries is always really important. I've always been interested to see how these chemistries will develop, as well as the kind of continuation and improvement of NMC batteries.
Great. Don Walter, are you on? You want to ask your question?
I am on. I actually asked three questions. The first,
Oh man.
Can I ask you to just ask one of the three because there are a number of other people that want to ask questions and we're
sure.
kind of limited on time. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. Um, yeah, the when I never see any BYD cars that I recognize on U.S. roads. What are the odds that we're going to be able to see Chinese branded cars being sold in the U.S.? I mean, there are big political barriers to that.
Yeah, so the reason why you don't see them is they're not one, they're tariffed at 100%, and because of something called the connected, like autonomous rule, they're really not. They're making it very difficult for Chinese makers to even just have the vehicles on U.S. soil. There have been a bunch of politicians recently who have reiterated their concerns and anxiety around it. I was in Thailand, so yeah, I saw a lot of BYDs there, or in Mexico, you would see it. Um, but yeah, I've got no update for you beyond that. It's very politically contentious, and not only that, but politically and economic kind of concerns as well.
Great. Thank you.
Well, I guess that raises the question then of would there be a lot of technological exchange between U.S. and
Hmm.
Chinese companies?
Yeah. It's definitely an open question, and it's an argument that some make around joint ventures and the like.
Mhm. Thanks very much.
I'd like to turn it over. Next question to Becky Bunnell, my co-chair of Yale Blue Green. Becky?
Hi. I actually had a question about solid state batteries. I hear some
Oh,
car makers are just starting to get into that, and that sounds like it's got huge range positive benefits. And what are your thoughts on that coming more mainstream?
yeah. I always like to say with like any of these battery chemistries, Becky, that it's like I'll believe it when they're producing it at mass volume. And for a period of time. I mean, solid state has a lot of benefits on the charging side as well. But automakers have been saying that they're really close to solid state for probably 7 years or so. There have been some articles out even as recently as today that I was taking a look at that say, China might be starting to produce them more volume. I think it was GAC group who was talking about it. In my head, and when I talked to like my old colleagues at Bloomberg, it's a 2030 story. So you might see articles about it now, but it's not really going to be, ever present here in the next couple of years.
Wasn't Volkswagen also looking at it, or did I miss that?
Everyone's looking at it.
Okay.
Toyota's been looking at it since 2017.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. Philip Falcone.
Um, I've uh, I've heard stories about being able to integrate your car into your home energy
Yeah.
plant, and utilities also taking advantage of cars that are off the road at the moment. And I was wondering how that is going to proceed.
Oh my God. Yeah, then welcome to like another, just like Amy's question. That could be I did a whole panel discussion at what's called the EV Charging Summit in Las Vegas on V2G or Vita Home. What I will say is Kia is bringing the EV3 over to the US this summer. They have a vehicle to home product, I believe, in California that they're testing out. The challenge around these kind of vehicle to grid or vehicle to home integration is it is very utility by utility area based on how savvy your utility is. And then your automaker needs to also make it a possibility. Ford, in particular, prior to canceling the F-150 Lightning, had highlighted it as a major benefit of EVs. So I would say, Phil, it's going to happen. It's just going to happen a little bit more slowly. And I think keep an eye on products and automakers who are able to, offer that benefit. Lastly, I'll say that on the topic of commercial vehicles, you see a lot of electric school buses used in kind of V2G, pilots because they sit around quite a bit and can be a way for schools to monetize those electric buses.
Well, we've got, I think, time for one more. I'm going to read this one from Richard Bradley. Beyond the four consumer concerns you mentioned on your slide, are consumers concerned about some of what you might call hidden costs? The cost of insurance, for example, which is considerably more than with ICE cars, or the cost of having a charger installed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if it's a question. I think it's just true. I think when you see insurance in particular, that's probably the main one that I would tell someone if they're looking at electric vehicle to make sure that they understand before they purchase the EV. On the charger aspect, what you're beginning to see is a lot more companies offering that as a part of your EV
Hello. Come right
purchase.
in, Phoebe.
So I'd say like Ford, for example, had a program where they were installing an EV charger at your home. So just like any car purchase, given how expensive these products have become, it's really
Can't
important to
figure
do
out how
your
to leave my
research
Zoom
and
link.
and to make sure that you're taking care of all of that in
Yeah.
advance. Um, but yeah, insurance is the one that I think a lot of people might miss in terms of a potential negative cost. We could talk about all the positive reasons and the less maintenance and the kind of fuel savings.
Yeah.
But insurance is the one where I'd say in a lot of the US where you take more of a hit. In places like California where there's more EVs on the road and insurance companies have a little bit more that they can kind of gauge data off of it, the kind of delta hasn't been as big, around 15%, but that's still higher than ICE.
Thank you, Corey. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, we've hit our limit here. I must say we've had a great turnout. Thank you so much for joining. I'm sure we could go on and talk about this more. Corey, you're a wealth of information. You've been a
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful guest. Thank you so, so much. We had so many uh, people and so many questions. We didn't have time to say hello from everybody. We actually had a uh, double guest with Margot and a friend who has joined us, which is a wonderful addition. But I want to thank everybody for joining us. We'll be posting a recording, and please save the chat if you want to go through. People made some great comments, but we'll also post the chat on our website, and come back next month, because every single month we have had incredible speakers, such amazing amounts of fascinating information. So please join us and spread the word. And thank you so, so much.
Thanks,
Have a
Chip.
great day. Bye bye.
Have a good one, guys.